So remember where we're at,
Okay, I'll
right
second.
here. We're going to go to item 15. Discussion item. We have Treasurer David Damson. Would you want to come up? And did you bring anybody with you?
Anybody want to join? I guess not, Chair.
There you go. Well,
I'm always
there's plenty
happy.
of room for you down there. Welcome.
Thank you. Let's see. It's on? Okay. Red means stop.
I know it's off.
Someone needs to talk to the vendor here and tell them red means don't talk. Green means go. Thank you, Chair Huntsman, members of the board. I appreciate your time, and I want to be as brief as I can. This is really just a continuation of the process I think I've referred to before with this board. It's really important to me and my team that given the areas where we have crossover, namely credit enhancement of district bonds, oversight of the school and institutional trust fund, and now with HB 404, which is how we've come to refer to it, right? Really oversight of the school children's trust overall, kind of in partnership with your board and with your children's trust section. And then furthermore, with our involvement in financing charter schools as a conduit issuer of most charter school bonds in the state. It's really important that we just get together from time to time. I do meet with the governor roughly quarterly, and we just keep an open dialogue, and that's really what this is about primarily. There's a couple of things related to charter school finance that I wanted to talk to you about, to get you thinking about. This is just informational at this point. There may be some implications and some actions that you might want to take. I don't have any preconceived notions or solutions that I want to recommend necessarily. You look at some things that look out of whack, and sometimes, unfortunately, we can be that hammer that sees every problem as a nail, and we want to pick up the phone and call the legislature and ask them to open a bill file, and I'm not sure we necessarily want to do that. I think that certainly in my office, there's a lot of problems that we solve every day without having legislation run, and I'm sure the same is true for you as a board. So there are two basic issues that I wanted to talk about today. One being struggling charter schools, or failing charter schools, or charter schools that are in turnaround or emerging from turnaround, and we've had a few of those. As you likely know, we've had charter schools fail. We've had charter schools struggle and get taken over by other charter schools. What we have not yet had happen is a charter school that has issued bonds in any significant amount, or taken on debt, I should say, in any significant amount, fail outright. We have had the takeover of a charter school that had debt financing in place. That has been affected. That has happened. But we haven't had that sort of worst case scenario of a charter school that has issued millions of dollars of bonds fail. Of course, over time, the more charter school bonds outstanding are issued, statistically speaking, the time factor and the dollar factor, as they grow, both grow in magnitude, the probability of having something occur increases. And so you could say it's not a matter of if, but when. I don't want to sound like that. I'm not alarmist at all. But I will give you, for context, a couple of figures. This is as of June 30th. We do track total charter school bonds issued by the Charter School Finance Authority, which I chair. It is the primary conduit for charter school bonds. We're not the only conduit. Some charter school bonds can be issued by cities and counties and even conduits outside of the state, and that's the second thing we're going to talk about in a moment. As of June 30th, let me also say, and I just to refresh you on this, I think we've talked about it before, there's a credit enhancement program of the state where the state will actually back the bonds of certain charter schools with a moral obligation pledge. We don't do that for all charter schools, just some. And the charter schools that apply for inclusion in that program, they save a lot of money on interest, because that credit enhancement improves their credit rating by 5 notches on the rating scale. And we estimate on average it reduces their borrowing costs by 1 3/4 to 2%, which on a $10 or $15 million transaction adds up to real money. So we have two general categories of bonds that I'm talking about when I give you these figures. Charter school bonds that are not enhanced by the state, where theoretically if the school failed and there was a dissolution, the state's not on the hook per se. The thing I want you to remember, and the reason I'm talking to you, is if we had any significant number of failures of schools and situations wherein investors in charter school bonds were harmed, that would affect us systemically, right? If we had several charter schools in Utah fail and investors harmed, then that could make it very difficult and or expensive for Utah charter schools to continue to access the municipal bond market going forward in a cost-effective manner. So a lot of this is really about not protecting the investors, and we've talked about this before, but really protecting the integrity of the marketplace and making sure that investor considerations are factored into our decision processes. So as of June 30th, the total charter school bonds outstanding that are unenhanced by the state were just over $344 million. No, that's enhanced, I'm sorry. And unenhanced, $324 million. And this is interesting that we now have the state backing more charter school bonds than not. And that transition just occurred over the past year or so. So it's real money. I want to point out it's important that I define the difference between those two categories of bonds. If there is a failing charter school that is credit enhanced by the state, we have provisions in code that give the Charter School Finance Authority a seat at the table in resolving the problems. Specifically, it says if the chartering entity proposes to terminate the charter of a qualifying charter school with bonds that have been enhanced, the chartering entity shall conduct a hearing. That hearing is inclusive of the Charter School Finance Authority. I'm going to jump down and not give you all the details, but importantly, it says that a chartering entity may not terminate the charter of a qualifying charter school with outstanding bonds that are enhanced without mutual agreement of the Utah Charter School Finance Authority and the chartering entity. And another quick refresher, the Charter School Finance Authority has a 3-member board, myself, Scott Jones, and Phil Dean from the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. That's who the Charter School Finance Authority is. It's not just me. So we already have a mechanism in place for a working partnership, if you will, between this board and the Charter School Finance Authority on those credit enhanced bonds, which, as I just established, is a bigger number than those that are not. But for those that are not credit enhanced, there is no such partnership defined in statute. I would recommend that some consideration be given to some form of dialogue or partnership come into play if a charter school with unenhanced bonds falls into trouble. Mainly, my concern is that when the charter schools enter into these transactions, they strike agreements with the investors and are subject to covenants. And we've looked at a particular charter school that's kind of been under discussion this past year. And we asked a bond attorney to do an analysis of the bond documents and tell us what are the relatively more preferable things that can or should be done in a situation where the charter school doesn't successfully emerge from the turnaround program. There are things that could be very damaging to investors and could violate covenants, and there are things that could be conforming with covenants. Many bond documents will have a conveyance exception in them, and so that's an important thing to know. Is there a conveyance exception that's defined in the bond documents? This is almost hierarchical, but this attorney listed at the top of options, place the charter school in the turnaround program. That's typically the starting point, right? Option 2, remove a charter school director, finance officer, or board member, or appoint an interim director or mentor to work with the charter school. Major personnel changes. Option number 3, it may be possible for the charter school to enter into a lease with a school district or another charter school to have those facilities operated under the lease. Option 4, consolidation or merger, and we've seen some of that already. As you start getting towards the bottom of the list, you're talking about terminating the charter, triggering events of default, and typically, of course, the investors hold title to the property, so they would be selling the building and those kinds of things that you contemplate when a mortgage fails or what have you. So that hierarchy of options can differ from school to school and transaction to transaction because different investors will have different requirements. And so I just want to encourage you to be mindful that if you're dealing with a charter school that's struggling, ensure that part of your decision process looks at, do they have bonds outstanding, and have we analyzed the bond documents, and do we understand what those bond documents tell us in terms of what are the less disruptive options versus more disruptive options before proceeding. And I've spoken with Chair Huntsman and the executive committee on this. I don't know that I have a recommendation. I don't know that we need to formalize anything. I think this board should give that some thought and think about how it and the state charter school board wants to address these things. I don't want to insert myself into anything unnecessarily. I just want to make sure that we have an open line of communication and let you know what my thoughts and concerns are. So that's issue number one. If you have any comments or questions on that, I'd be happy to take them.
Got quite a few here. I was going to dive in on the comments, but I don't think it would help, so I'll let these others get in. Board member Linda Hansen.
Hi. So the charter school that it didn't successfully come out of turnaround is in my district. My question, I guess, on that is they are part of a two-school instead of just being their own school. So how does that affect it when there's more than one entity involved?
Thank you. Mr. Chair, that's an excellent scenario to talk about because you have two separate campuses. One is failing and one's not, is my understanding. But in the financing, it's one financing, and both sets of assets, both facilities are all wrapped into one transaction. And it underscores, in my opinion, the importance of understanding what these implications are. You can't just, well, let's just close that school and let the one that's functioning adequately continue on, or it's not. You want to make sure you're taking those issues under consideration. That's why this particular scenario that we're talking about is such a good example. And I want to make it really clear. And every time I talk about this, I make it really clear. I'm not concerned about that school. The academic performance and the governance of a charter school, particularly one that isn't credit enhanced, it's not my deal. I'm really not wanting to insert myself into it. I'm an observer. I'm concerned that we have processes in place, and as I said earlier, I'm concerned about the stability and the integrity of our marketplace for charter schools to be able to access funding. That's where it really comes from. And also, I'll say, I was in the banking industry for 20 years. I think it's really important that we as a state treat counterparties, whether they're governmental or private, like investors. We treat them with respect. And I think if we don't have processes in place, and if we're ignoring those covenants that we've allowed our charter schools who are funded by taxpayer funds, if we're allowing those situations to unfold in very disruptive and unruly ways, and I'm not suggesting that they would or could without this discussion, but I just want to make sure that we have a solid process in place because it's the right thing to do, and we want to be respectful of that business community that we rely upon to educate our children.
Treasurer, just a couple thoughts here. We're not talking about a particular school or anything, but just for our board members. Situational awareness. We've got on-ramps for charters. We're talking about basically charters to go in debt. We also I guess I'll ask you, do we have off ramps that say if they're default, this is what we do and this is how we mitigate it to transfer the debt or what do we do when they're delinquent and that? Are we lacking on that side? Or
I would say yes, and that's why we're having this conversation.
Okay,
because as I said at
bring
the
into context here.
we haven't.
So it's really easy to get into this world.
It's uncharted territory
Okay,
thus far.
There's another part of this that I see as the question at hand because we're not going to solve it now. Does this board do we choose to be proactive and as we get this intelligence to react, or are we going to wait and be reactive to certain situations? And that's a part that I'm a little bit fearful of the board member, just say, well, we can't, what do we have to do to keep it open? Because we can't have them default on their loan, but we know for one reason or another that that education piece isn't happening, but we're worrying about our bond ratings and everything else. Are we setting ourselves up to be into that world because the lack of direction of being proactive on the, I call it the off-ramp or off-boarding?
Well, I think it's a great question. You're bringing up another thing that we're working on. I wasn't necessarily going to bring up today because it's a little bit premature, but we can go ahead and talk about it. It may give you a little bit of comfort. Let me start, though. So there's kind of an issue number 3 that I'm going to insert into this conversation as part of my answer to your question. But before I do that, I would say that these charter school transactions all include a debt service reserve. And so when the charter school borrows money from the investor and say they need $10 million for the facility, they'll actually borrow $10 million plus enough to pay a full year's debt service. And that's put into a reserve fund with a trustee. So it's a little bit of a emergency buffer, and it's there on all of these transactions. So know that so that you don't lose sleep thinking that we don't have some good risk mitigating components in the system, if I can call it that. The other thing that I can tell you is this concern that I have about the growing charter school debt that we have, and knowing that charter schools are also unique and they don't have the heft, if you will, or the depth necessarily in terms of administrative support as LEAs that a district typically does. I'm interested in putting in place some form of a monitoring system that helps us to look at key financial ratios and so forth. So I just met with Deputy Superintendents Jones and Stalling and Auditor Dougal earlier this week on this very subject. What I don't want to do is create a redundant process that additionally or unnecessarily burdens charter schools with new reporting requirements. So we need to define, there are basically 2 categories of things that I'm really focused on monitoring. One is financial indicators. I'll leave the education, the educational performance to you and the State Charter School Board. I'm focused on financial indicators, and then also after bonds are issued, charter schools, like school districts, like the state, like any municipal bond issuer, charter schools are not issuers, they're borrowers. The state's the issuer. But once the charter school issues the bonds or is involved in a bond transaction, they become obligated to disclose certain information on an ongoing and annual basis. It's called a continuing disclosure undertaking. It's required. And there's some things that they disclose are mandated by the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and some things that they report are mandated by the Charter School Finance Authority, and some things are mandated by the investor. So we're concerned about financial indicators and compliance with disclosure obligations, basically. So I'm working to put in place a monitoring process. So we have a finger on the pulse and we see if a school is missing, if they're late in filing a disclosure or something like that, so we can recognize some struggles at a school. So I'm working on that. I think that's an appropriate thing for the Charter School Finance Authority in my office to take on, so we're just putting that together. I've made some changes to staffing to facilitate this. We never previously had a debt manager, and we created a debt manager position, pulling a debt accounting function away from the Division of Finance this past year. So I have an employee who's been in my office for a number of years, but she's new to this debt manager position, and she's had her hands full with the state's disclosure and the state's current bond issue that we're pricing next week. And so it's a next year priority for her to work with me and my chief deputy to put this process in place. So that's part of the answer, I think, to your question is we'll put this process in place that'll help us monitor some things that maybe your finance folks and you and the state charter school board and the state auditor aren't necessarily paying attention to that we're uniquely concerned about because they're linked to this market disclosure and financial performance. Does that all make sense? I don't know if that helps answer your question, but that's...
Well, it was close. I just wanted to bring that awareness out as I was asking those questions and that to the board, as we talked about earlier. We have right now there's 4 board members that have questions or comments, so we'll be hitting those. First will be board member Lisa Cummins. And
Thank
then
you,
Carol,
Chair.
you're on deck.
Thank you, Treasurer, for coming. Nice to see you. Just some points of clarification. So there's $324 million of unenhanced bonds currently.
Correct.
And you mentioned that there's 10 million plus put into a trust for every transaction. So out of what the 35 plus that I saw, that there's 10 million per.
Well, I threw out a for instance.
Okay.
A $10 million bond, if $10 million were needed to purchase a facility, the maximum annual debt service for that transaction might be $500,000 or $700,000. I was saying that the total borrowings would include funds sufficient to pay all the fees and the attorneys and the investment bankers and so forth, buy the facility and poke into a reserve fund 1 year debt service.
1 year.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's 1 year debt service.
Okay. And is this buffer also for in times of downturn in the economy? Or is this just bond?
I think
Or
it's
is this
really there
everything?
for anything that would cause a charter school to struggle to meet its obligations.
Okay.
This ties to the mechanism of the credit enhancement program. I don't know if you want to go that far down the rabbit hole, but
Okay.
the moral obligation pledge of the state, which is the credit enhancement mechanism, starts with a charter school draws on that reserve. If they do, and they're credit enhanced, then the Charter School Finance Authority tells the governor, we want replenishment of that draw in your budget request. And the governor is required by law to include that in his budget going into the session. The legislature may appropriate those funds. Now, I tell legislators when we talk about this that your hands aren't not tied. You're not forced to make those appropriations. But if you don't make those appropriations, that'll have far-reaching effects. Because not only are charter schools credit enhanced by the moral obligation mechanism, so are higher education bonds. And so if you choose not to back anything under the moral obligation pledge program, if I can call it that, you're compromising the integrity of everything enhanced under that. And we're talking well over $1 billion in debt.
Wow.
So it's pretty strong support from the state, especially given the state's AAA bond rating and the reputation we have for strong fiscal management. I think investors have strong confidence that the credit enhancement program means we're going to step up and make sure that process plays out and the legislature appropriates those funds. So,
Okay. Well, thank you.
you bet.
Board member Lear, and then board member Scott Hansen, you're on deck.
My eyes typically glaze over when I hear this stuff, but I'm trying really hard because I think it's so important as a state board that we remember that we are responsible for all of public education.
It's exciting stuff, isn't it?
So, it's so exciting.
I know. I can't control myself. I'm
I'm
just.
so proud of me for paying such rapt attention. But I do have a real serious question for you, and I have to also kind of, I had an old boss who used to say every government bureaucrat should treat the money that he has responsibility for or she has responsibility for like it's his own or her own. And I think that was really, really good advice. And I tried to be that. I tried to be that kind of government bureaucrat. But so I ask you if because you're kind of being careful in telling us what our job is. But I'm asking you as the caretaker, essentially, for Utah's funds, including those that go to public education. Is this something that you would be concerned about? And I know you're here because you're concerned about it. But are you saying to us this is something we should get right on and pay attention to? If this were your money, would you expect that from the steward of this subset of funds?
Yeah, I think the important thing is that we're talking about this before we're confronted with that worst-case scenario, that we're contemplating it, we're thinking about it, and we maybe put a process in place. What I do not want to do is, I'm very, very tuned in to the provisions in our state's constitution and deeply respectful of this board's role. And what I don't want to do, where we have crossover or shared responsibilities, what I don't want to do is usurp or so it's something that I think we have shared responsibility for, and it's something that we work together to resolve. And so I don't want to be prescriptive with anything that I'm telling you, just lay out what it is. And I think it's good that we're in front of it and that we're thinking about it, and that some form of process be put in place. How or exactly what that looks like.
Especially for these unenhanced bonds, is that what you're saying? Especially because there's a
Correct.
process for the enhanced.
Right, yeah, for the enhanced bonds, it's in statute, and we are going to be at the table working together under the law on the enhanced. And I would just suggest that for unenhanced and really for any charter school that has significant debt outstanding, because we deal with charter school finance, municipal bonds, municipal market disclosure, that's kind of our thing. I think we're willing to chip in and come to the table and help out in resolving these things in an orderly fashion and in a way that's respectful of the marketplace and the educational system.
I have a very short follow-up to that. And you were also mentioning disclosure as part of this process. Is the disclosure adequate or inadequate for the unenhanced?
So, under SEC rules, a charter school is a borrower, and the Charter School Finance Authority or whichever conduit issues the bonds is the issuer of the bonds. The disclosure obligation falls upon the borrower. Under SEC rules are defined as a obligated person, and so those disclosure obligations are the charter school's obligations. And to this point, no, they're not adequate. No, charter schools do occasionally miss their required filings, or they're late with required filings, and there's some room for improvement there. And anyone, and I'm sure there are people sitting behind me that have been to meetings of the Charter School Finance Authority, I harp about this at every single meeting of the Charter School Finance Authority, and I strongly encourage charter school board members to understand that, hey, while you go and hire a CMO to handle your accounting and so forth, realize the ultimate responsibility rests upon you as a board, and make sure you're knowledgeable of these requirements, that you have annual compliance training. If you have to have a bond attorney come in and give you periodic training, it might cost a few bucks, but we haven't yet, the Charter School Finance Authority has not yet disapproved of financing because of deficiencies in terms of disclosure, but that day could come. I prefer not to let that. Typically, those deficiencies in disclosure are typically not so substantial that they should preclude going forward with the financing.
Thank you. I don't want to take more time, but I also have to add, and ultimately, this board is responsible for the money, not just the charter school board, because the charter school board has no assets. The state board is the keeper of the financial responsibility for all parties.
So Carol, where this is going, because we've seen this servicing, there's seen more risk, we don't have really clear guidelines, and there's an opportunity for some betterments along the way. Most likely this will end up moving forward and having some discussion maybe in finance or in one particular committee, working with the treasurer and also the state charter board, and that. This is information for our awareness, and then we can choose to do what we need to do on our side. And it's better that we do it together than not do anything at all and let something bad happen. So let's just to get us up to speed that there's a little bit of a concern, and a little weakness in our process is that we can bring those betterments forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could too, I have had this conversation with the State Charter School Board. I want to make sure that, you know, we're all working together and we have a high level of transparency and open communication.
Okay. Board Member Scott Hansen and then Board Member Linda Hansen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Treasurer. I'm understanding that we have enhanced bonds where there's some kind of process that the charter school goes through in order to obtain that bond rating or bond backing through the state. And then we have these unenhanced bonds, and those are the ones we're concerned about right now. We're talking about putting in a process to make them semi-enhanced, maybe, so that if they fail, they would fail gracefully. Is that what I'm hearing?
I'll go with that. That sounds great.
What I'm wondering, we've got these unenhanced bonds that exist right now to deal with. Is there a reason to keep perpetuating that? Can we put into the chartering process some requirement that the charter schools would obtain that enhanced rating so that we wouldn't deal with this or wouldn't have this building up in the future?
Well, thank you. Mr. Chair, I would say that's problematic in that the credit enhancement program is designed to ensure that we're really kind of taking the state's balance sheet and putting, you know, skin in the game, the state's skin in the game here back in these schools. We really don't want to do that for all charter schools because a lot of these unenhanced charter school bonds, they're charter schools that have not been in existence for very long. They have relatively high, you know, credit risk ratings, and they represent a certain level of risk that is arguably, because we're getting into policy now, a level of risk that is arguably inappropriate for the state to step in and provide that form of credit enhancement.
So then the follow-on question becomes, should we be chartering those schools if they have that unacceptable risk?
Oh, well, that's not my call, but I think yes, because if you look at the enhanced, you see, to qualify for the credit enhancement program, there's governance components, financial metrics, there's academic performance. It's stringent, it's rigorous, it's stringent. And as I said, we have more schools that are credit enhanced than not. And those schools that are credit enhanced started unenhanced. You can't receive credit enhancement right up front. Most of these credit enhanced transactions are what are called refundings. So basically the school started, as most schools do, a developer built the facility, they're leasing from the developer. Once they've been in operation for 3, 4, 5 years, now they can even issue bonds, and the marketplace there are investors that'll buy their bonds. The bonds are placed and sold unenhanced, and then they develop strength in terms of financial performance, other things, and now they, you know, so one of the things I like about the credit enhancement program, we talked a lot about this when it was formed, is because the significant savings schools can realize, it creates an aspirational, it's a big fat carrot. Schools look at the program, at the credit enhancement program requirements and say, hey, we better get our ratios in line, and we better, you know, make sure we have strong governance and meet all these, because we want to reduce our costs and come under the credit enhancement program at some point. So I think it's really beneficial to our community of charter schools, if you will, because it gives them something extra. I mean, they have ample motivation to be well governed, to provide sound education, but this gives them added incentive, added financial incentive to do so. I think it's a good thing that way.
Thank you for clarifying that. I was under the impression they could get that enhancement right off the get-go, and yeah, thanks.
Treasurer Damson, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and helping us on this information item. I'm sure you've got some more there, don't you? Or
If you have time, I have a second issue I wanted to mention.
okay.
Are you okay on time?
Well, for you, yes.
This is just to make you aware, and this is similar. I don't have a strong recommendation. I have some ideas and thoughts on it, but I mentioned before that schools are not required to use the Charter School Finance Authority as conduit to issue the bonds. Before the Charter School Finance Authority was created in 2007, schools would go to their city or their county and have them function as conduit, and they would typically pay a conduit fee. One of the things that's unique about the Utah Charter School Finance Authority, we don't charge a fee at all. So once the authority came into being, the vast majority, 99% probably, of all charter school deals in Utah get done through the authority. There have been a handful of schools since the authority was created that have gone through other conduits in the state. There have been a very, very small set of transactions that have been done through conduits outside of the state. And we haven't paid a lot of attention to it. We're a very small office. The staffing and a lot of the legwork for these transactions is done by my team. And so we don't really want a monopoly on charter school transactions, and we don't mind that City of Provo or Utah County get involved from time to time. We're fine with that. It came to our attention this last year that a particular charter school did a transaction through a conduit in Arizona. And there's a number of concerns I have. Our meetings of the authority are subject to the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act. And we're, of course, subject to GRAMA and everything else from a transparency standpoint that we all recognize is needed in government to ensure transparency and safety and stewardship of taxpayer resources. So you go to an out-of-state conduit, you lose some of that. Maybe not all, but some. This particular school did not use a municipal advisor, which is a fiduciary. If you choose a strong municipal advisor, they will help you do sound procurement of legal services, underwriter, et cetera, to make sure that you're cost effective. There was no use of a fiduciary municipal advisor. They're not required by federal law or state law to do so. So it's not that any laws were broken, but for bond, well, let me start with total cost of issuance was $29.74 per thousand. Compared with the last 10 transactions that we've done, that's about a 34% premium over. Now, we looked at comparable type transactions. It's a smaller premium. It's like 13% over in terms of cost. But there are little pockets of really concerning things here. Bond counsel was $70,000. That's 45% more than a 10 transaction average here in Utah. The conduit issuer in Arizona, they charged $55,000 as a fee to effect the transaction. Remember, we charge nothing. Why would you do that? Borrowers counsel, the attorney that served the school, is not bond counsel but borrowers counsel, was paid $50,000. That's, depending on what comparable you look at, that's between double and 4 times the market here in Utah. One of the things that we've done with the Charter School Finance Authority in Utah is we've worked hard to develop a marketplace of high transparency, high competition, and high professional competence. Those 3 areas have improved immensely in Utah, but I'm here to tell you they're not that good in other states necessarily. Other states maybe haven't been as proactive as we have, and I'm not bragging, I'm just saying we've looked at these things, and some of these attorneys complain that, oh, it's just so hard to make a living here in Utah. Well, that's good. You know, that's good for our taxpayers, right? I'm sorry?
Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Thank you. You said borrowers counsel, $55 per hour, 1,000?
No, the Borrowers Council was a $50,000 fee. And what we've seen as an average over the last 10 transactions in the state was $25,540. So it's double on that basis. If we look at the best comparable transactions, and this is as defined by my deputy, I'd have to ask him how he defined that. We're seeing Borrowers Council paid $10,000 or $11,000 on a lot of transactions. So that's like 4 or 5 times as much on Borrowers Council. The trustee fee, $9,500. This went to a trustee in Kansas, UMB Bank. Our charter school transactions here, they tend to go to Zions or US Bank, both trustees with offices here in Utah. And I'm sorry to keep diving into the rabbit hole with y'all, but this is important stuff for you to know. There are 3 primary trustees in Utah that have what are called omnibus accounts with my office. So you know that we run an investment pool and we manage about $14 billion in public funds in Utah. Your school districts, your city, your county invest with us. And we have the highest yielding state investment pool in the country that we're aware of. It's about 2.7% right now. And this is daily liquidity, all right? Wells Fargo, Zions Bank, and U.S. Bank all have what are called omnibus accounts in their corporate trust departments, whereby you can take these bond proceeds that are held by the trustee and invest them in Utah with my state investment pool, which complies automatically with the provisions of the Utah Money Management Act, which says what you can or cannot invest in Utah. And you're accessing this 2.7% yield on the investments, which I'm quite sure is not available at UMB Bank. So this UMB trustee in Kansas, $9,500 fee, which is between double and triple what we typically see with Utah trustees. So it's just right down the line, a little bit of a pillaging. It's let's take this transaction, get it done outside of the state. So we might think about possibly, I've asked some hard questions of the professionals that are charging these fees, and I've asked the question, what is the overriding necessity of using an out-of-state conduit? There are situations where we absolutely have to have that door left open. And honestly, I believe the answer is there are no such scenarios. I think it's something that we should consider restricting use of these out-of-state conduits because of all of the reasons I've mentioned, the loss of transparency, loss of accountability, and the pillaging that tends to occur with such transactions.
Follow up?
Oh, is this particular charter school, is this money under the unenhanced bond? Is this part of that?
No, and I don't know a
category?
lot of details. This is a school that's not only not enhanced, but it was a complicated and difficult transaction, and
Can
which
you
doesn't
name
mean
it
that we
publicly?
could not or should not have handled it as a conduit.
Okay.
But I think it was a fairly high risk transaction. Definitely not credit enhanced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you name the school publicly?
I'm sorry.
Should we name the public school publicly?
Well, I don't really want to throw them under the bus. I'm happy to share that information.
We'll do it offline.
Yeah, and we haven't spoken with the school. We want to ask the school some questions about
We can do it offline.
the sales pitches that they were given and so forth that
So-
took them down this road.
And so this is all really, really good stuff to help our awareness, because a lot of us that when we got on the board years ago, and then you've got new members starting this month, we several times in the finance committee, I thought, I didn't know we were a bank. I didn't know that we were this. I didn't know we had these different responsibilities, and this is pretty significant. And so I want to thank the treasurer for bringing this to our attention, and Deputy Superintendent Jones works with you, and he brought it to my attention before. And so we're not saying the sky is falling. We just say, okay, we see we got some we need to move some betterments forward and get all on the same page, and might take the legislature, might take a few things, but this is all part of the evolution of what's happening with charters and funding. And so thank you for bringing that to our attention, and it did a really good job. And we start talking about money and everything. It just seems really kind of odd that in the past nobody wanted to get on finance with us. It's not finance; it's called finance now. And I don't know what's changed. It's just really, really popular to deal with all these numbers, I guess. I'm just kidding, but we do have that responsibility, and we're very fortunate we have a board that cares about all these numbers and our responsibilities there. So thank you. I think, Cindy, did you have a question?
Yeah. Forgive my ignorance. I know as a school district, when we have capital needs and things, parent groups go out and sort of beg the taxpayers, and then we bond for these things. How does this bond process happen in the first place? Who's approving the charter schools to bond in the first place for their capital needs or things that they're doing?
There's no comparable process. It's market driven. If the charter school can find willing investors to buy the bonds. To my knowledge, there's nothing comparable.
Well, there's, there's statutes in place. Our lawmakers on the Hill put this together so that this process to get funding. And it's totally different than what we were doing on it as a local board member. And what we declare truth in taxation, try to get something passed. And so this is pretty unique, but I believe moving forward, as we look at our statutes and different things, that there might be some recommendations coming forward to bring those betterments, better transparency. The list can continue to grow as we get into it, but it is very unique.
Okay, so
Follow up.
none, basically, you're saying? They just go and do it?
They don't do
I-
what
sorry,
we were
I-
doing. They don't have to do it.
Yeah, they do not need to seek voter approval. There's no bond election, anything like that. It's not really comparable to what the
Or
districts
like
do.
any board approval or anything?
I think you're going to weigh in on it, aren't you, Vice
Their
Chair?
own board? Okay, thanks. Sorry, I was unfamiliar.
Vice Chair Brittany Cummins?
So if I understand the process correctly, for a district, they're actually increasing taxes in order to bond, right? So when a charter school goes through this process, they aren't increasing anyone's taxes. It's like going out and getting a loan where you're paying it back through your MSP funding or the regular funding that you get. So there's no tax increase when the charter school goes through the process, whereas you have to have approval of the taxpayers because you're actually increasing their taxes as a school district. So I think that's probably the biggest difference. But the board of that charter school has to approve any of these transactions.
If I could,
But taxpayers ultimately are left holding the bag if there's a default, right? So is that correct?
on unenhanced transactions, no, not necessarily. Now, on district bonds, the state guarantees those bonds outright. So yes, the state's backing those 100%. On the credit enhanced charter school bonds, I feel the state is, given all of those caveats and so forth in the moral obligation pledge mechanism, the state's still backing those up and could be holding the bag, so to speak. Sure.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you. I'm sure we're going to have future discussions on this topic as time goes on, and thank you for being here.
Thank you all. I appreciate your time. Appreciate what you do. Thank you for your service.
Okay. Thank you.